Hello, this is Paul from debateLove.com. Let me explain why I think that the EU Superstate is just another radical utopia, which can actually get quite dangerous if things continue the way they're going right now. Very radical ideologies often aim at achieving some kind of utopia. For example, communism aimed to create a utopia where everyone was finally going to be equal, and they wanted to achieve this in every country globally. And this all sounds very nice, but what are you going to do with the people who are good at something and therefore achieve an unequal outcome? And what are you going to do with those people who do not like your idea? Another example is Nazism, which wanted to turn Europe into a utopia of grandiose excellence and perfection, which was going to be a celebration of the so-called Aryan race. The capital of this Europe was going to be Welthauptstadt Germania, World Capital Germania, with Roman architecture everywhere to emphasize that this is really the successor of the Roman Empire. This time not created in the south of Europe, but in the north of Europe. And this again sounds very nice, but what are you going to do with all the Jewish people, and all the gypsies, and all the handicapped, and all the other people who do not belong to this so-called Aryan race? And what are you going to do with those people who do not like your idea? And that is where it usually goes wrong with these kinds of ideas. So what these two political ideologies have in common is that they were both trying to achieve some kind of goal. And this goal was claimed to be a utopia. But in order to reach this utopia, there are a few problems that need to be solved first. Some people, whether it be the bourgeois or the Jewish people, need to either be removed or need to dramatically change their behavior in order to fit in with the ideology, if this is possible at all. But even if these people need to be removed, it is supposed to be justified, because the end justifies the means. The utopia they're trying to achieve is so great and so important that it doesn't matter if some people need to be removed, because in the end it will be all worth it, they usually claim. And the forefighters of these ideologies have something in common too. What they have in common is that all of them have blinders on. In Dutch we call it oogkleppen. Just like this horse with oogkleppen, blinders on. This horse can only see the path towards the goal and nothing else. The forefighters of these type of ideologies are basically partly blind. They only see the goal, the utopia, and they're blind to the negative consequences of their actions and deaf to opposing viewpoints. Now let's keep in mind what I just said, and let's take a look at the EU project. And let me start by saying that the EU project is quite a radical project, because the goal is to create a European superstate with centralized power. Europe has always been a continent with many different countries. And even though these countries do share the same Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian basis, they still are quite different from one another, and they have their own identity, language and history. So trying to combine these countries into one single country is a very strange, radical and extreme idea. And let me emphasize this. The idea to combine all these countries into one country is not a moderate idea. It is a radical idea. And is also quite unnecessary. Why would countries that have always been separate countries need to become one country? It doesn't make much sense if you take a second to think about it. Do Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica and Panama have to become one country with centralized power? Or do Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia and Vietnam have to become one single country with centralized power? Well, if they all want it, why not? Perhaps they would stand stronger against China and India if they were one large country with centralized power. So perhaps they would be better off. Or perhaps not. Or perhaps the positive effects and the negative effects would compensate one another, and the net result would be quite neutral. But what if the people who are living in these countries do not want it? In that case they do not have to. The right to self-determination allows them to decide for themselves. So because the EU superstate is a very radical idea, and because Europe is the birthplace of the right to self-determination, the people who are trying to implement the EU superstate should do it very carefully and respectfully. I think the process of creating such a superstate, if at all, should be as follows. they should be extra careful and extremely open and respectful towards resistance. They should repeatedly ask, is everyone still on board? And have a referendum in every member state at least once a year to check if every European population is still on board. And if a population of a country says no, they should very respectfully engage with the representatives of the specific country, or with the representatives of the people who are against their idea. They should engage in a dialogue and perhaps half a year later have another referendum. And if the people then do agree with the creation of the EU superstate, they should proceed very slowly and be very open and transparent about what they're going to do next. And if the people really don't want it, they should very politely allow the specific country to leave without imposing sanctions or trying to demonize the specific country. This is what the implementation of such a radical idea should ideally look like, especially in Europe, because Europe is the birthplace of Western values, and especially because of the lessons of the 20th century. So let's go back to the current reality and immediately make the point that the Europeans did not want the European Constitution back in 2005. This should have given a very clear signal to the people running the show in Brussels that what they're doing the people do not want. And this is where things got a bit scary, because they did it anyway. The process that's currently going on in Europe is very different than what I just described. They're just going on with it, repeatedly ignoring referenda left and right, demonizing everyone who doesn't agree with their idea. A country doesn't like something they want to impose on them, then they just blackmail them and bully their way through the resistance, threatening them with sanctions, as if they were dealing with some kind of dictator instead of a democratically elected prime minister of a country in Europe. Is there an election somewhere and is there a candidate who is against the EU superstate? Let's slander them, cut off their funds, try to sue them, and tell the people who vote for the candidate that they're all racist. Is there a country that decided to leave? Let's give them an as hard time as possible. And is there a country that refuses to receive members of Islam into the society? They just spread fake news about them, such as all the fake news about Poland and Hungary that you're probably receiving from your mainstream media, assuming that you're living somewhere in Western Europe. And please note that I'm not trying to compare the EU superstate project to communism. That would be an exaggeration because it isn't that bad. However, I do think that it could become much more unpleasant than it is today. Because even though the type of people who are at the top of the EU often point to the lessons of the 20th century to justify their project, what they don't see, because they have blinders on, is that their project is not a solution to the horrible 20th century, but instead that their project is slowly becoming more like the type of problems that created the horrible 20th century.
The constitution was rejected last year by France and the Netherlands. Do you think the constitution should be revived or should we start from scratch?
No, I think that we have to continue the ratification process because that keeps the pressure on the European institutions and the European leaders to continue the European integration. So I think that we have to continue this ratification process.
But then you would disregard the votes in France and the Netherlands.
So that is their responsibility to see at what moment it is possible to do that.
The EU superstate is a bit like a political ideology that must be achieved, because the outcome will be a bit like a utopia. And this sounds very nice, but what are you going to do with the people who do not like your idea? Or the people who are critics of your idea? We've already seen that the people who are at the top of the EU have turned it into a habit to call people who do not agree with their radical idea populists, xenophobes, racists, etc. And we're also seeing how they're treating Poland and Hungary. As you might have seen in some of my other videos about the EU, the people who are running it are very radical people, who as time goes by seem to be acquiring some of the characteristics that certain other radical people who try to achieve some kind of utopia had. They all have oogkleppen on and believe that their idea is so amazing that shutting down people who don't agree with it is justified. And this is something that might escalate, Because the first time you decide to call people who do not like your idea populist and xenophobes, it might feel a bit weird, but after that you'll get used to it. And when you find out that it didn't work, you have to do something else. And then you decide that it is a good idea to force social media companies to shut down the Facebook and Twitter accounts of people who do not like your idea. And then you'll get used to that too. And then you find out that that also doesn't work. And then you're wondering what you're going to do next. And this process of escalation is dangerous. Because what are you going to do if people simply start making other social media accounts and even stop caring about what the mainstream media tell them? You know, the media that the EU is trying to use to indoctrinate people through, such as by their Respect Words program, sponsored by the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. As the so-called populist parties in Europe are slowly becoming more popular, the people who are in charge of the EU are slowly radicalizing. They are very slowly turning into the same type of radicals that the original idea of cooperation on a European level was actually a response towards. So the fact that the people who are in charge of the EU are very radical people with blinders on, who seem to be becoming more radical, is the reason why the EU should absolutely not have control over an army. These type of radical people should not have military firepower, because then it can go really wrong. Because what are they going to do if the Visegrad 4 continue to oppose their will? And economic sanctions and collaborating with dangerous figures like this Mr. Soros doesn't work anymore? Are they going to send their European army to Budapest? Or what are they going to do when there is a Nexit referendum in the Netherlands, which by then they will of course have declared to be quote-unquote illegal, and the Dutch people are leaving their houses to go vote anyway? Will it be a bit like in Catalonia, but instead of the police beating up people in the streets, will it be the European army beating up people in the streets? Anyway, I cannot predict the future. Europe is an extremely interesting and dynamic continent, but I'd like to ring the proverbial alarm bell here. The people who are at the top of the EU and their dream about the EU Superstate. History often takes an unexpected turn, and while everyone is looking at Russia, or perhaps even at these so-called populists, to be the next big evil that everyone is supposed to be afraid of, I think the next big evil is much more likely to be the EU itself, with their goal to create a superstate and with their European army that they're about to get. Let's keep an eye on the European Union and be open-minded to the idea that things are about to get rough in Europe. This is Paul from debateleft.com. If you like the content, subscribe to this channel or please consider supporting my work through Patreon. Or you can also check out my book. Almost 5,000 copies have already been sold. Thanks for watching and have a good day everyone.